But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not go in yourselves, and when others are going in, you stop them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, whoever swears by the sanctuary is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by the oath. You blind fools! For which is greater, the gold or the sanctuary that has made the gold sacred? And you say, whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar is bound by the oath. How blind you are! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the sanctuary swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by the one who is seated upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides! You strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee! First clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside may also become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding of blood of the prophets. Thus you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your ancestors. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how can you escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets, sages, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteousness bloodshed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly, I tell you, all this will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.
Thanks, Steve. Kind of not screwing around anymore, right? It's kind of a serious one. If you're new here this morning or haven't been in a while, we've been in this series from Matthew, as strange as it is to say, since the week after Easter of 2021. We are getting close to the end of the series. We'll wrap it up on the 21st of August. But one of the things that we've been doing, at least I'd like to think we've been doing from the very beginning, is looking really closely at the historical context and the original meaning and trying to see this not just through the eyes of Jesus, but also through the eyes of Matthew, the author, and as an artist with a palette of colors to work with, like why is he choosing to tell this story here, and what exactly is he trying to do to his audience in AD 70-something. And to whatever extent we've been successful of doing that, of historical context and some of that work, it's not really my intention this morning. And the way I arrive at this place is, my method is I try to spend time in the text several months before I'm going to teach on it. I'm trying to spend time with it personally and be impacted so I can speak out of some kind of a personal experience. And for me, as I worked through Matthew 23, especially the woes part, I didn't find myself at all interested in or gravitating to the historical context of like the golden grapevine and the different conversations about tithing, even proselytizing. Like that wasn't where I had the questions. Instead, what emerged from me ultimately was really just this one question. And so what I'd like to do this morning is kind of frame it around this. And it's a simple, potentially self-absorbed, but I don't think it has to be question of, are you living the life God called you to live? Now, if you don't have the sense of God called, then that's okay. We'll come back to you in just a second. But so many of you, especially sitting in a church in late July and in a hell in a summer, the extent to which you're here, that would lead me to believe that you're likely to be somebody who at some point, whether it was a month or a year ago or a few decades ago, had some kind of personal experience with God, some kind of moment or even season of time where you formed this strong connection. Maybe it was kind of out of nowhere, maybe if it was after a long series of exposure, but there was this moment where you set out to live a certain life, where God called you to be a certain kind of person. It might have been way back when you were a child, it might have been in your 50s when you went through a divorce, maybe you survived cancer or something, maybe there was a marriage or a new business, or you moved to a new town. But to the extent that you've had it, what I'd like to do this morning is take you back to that spot and then just ask the question. And again, I hope that you're not feeling implied shame, because that's not my intent, but just, are you living the life that God called you to live? Because I think part of what we see from Matthew 23 is this warning that it's possible. It's possible to set off on one course and end up somewhere else. And if you don't connect to the personal experience with God thing, that's okay. Like we genuinely create this space to be helpful no matter where you're at in this point in your journey. I think there's another way to ask, and it's just simply, are you living the life you set out to live? Maybe there was this moment of suffering. Maybe it was something like recovery, or you got caught, or there was some heartbreak, or a toxic relationship that came to an end, or a job that came to an end, or a door that closed. And for you, that solidified there's a certain person you want to be and a certain person you'd like to avoid being. Maybe there's a point of contrast, whether it was a coworker or somebody else, and that just helped you kind of go like, this isn't who I want to be, or this is who I want to be. And again, I think Matthew 23 provides the opportunity to ask the question, are you on that course? If you can slow down enough, if you can get outside of the daily list of things to do, are you staying true to those commitments? And if still that doesn't do it for you, I think there's this third question that at the very least is worth considering, and that's this: are you aware that you're becoming someone? That you're not just a person who has a series of experiences and accomplishments and activities, and you're not just acquiring stuff. You're becoming a person. And to the extent that Jesus of Nazareth is a reliable thinker, his great warning is this warning of what you get out of this life is who you become, the character that you build. The promise that he gives in his greatest sermon is that if you follow him, he'll give you the kind of life that can withstand any of life's storms. We're working on this series for the fall. We're going to step away from Matthew and this kind of book-by-book thing, or chapter-by-chapter in a book thing, and kind of going to amalgamate our old style and our new, and we're going to do this series called Your Mental Game, and part of what we want to do is validate the role of mental health professionals, and we're going to, in a couple different instances, get those people on the stage and do some interview stuff. But the other thing we want to do in this series is just ask the question, like, what's the low-hanging fruit? What's the, like, back to the basics? Like, what are the things that if we're not doing these, then the mental health professionals maybe can't even help us. And we want to in particular look at the text and what are some of the ancient wisdoms and disciplines that we can lean into from the text. Well, in the process of studying that, I just finished up a book on neuroplasticity, because part of what I want to explore is just this extraordinary thing that we have called the brain, which ought to encourage us in our capacity for our potential for change. And I think, to Matthew 23's point, terrify us to the extent that we can become something other than what we set out to become. Well, in this book, the author, and I chose not to, or I haven't made any effort to retain his name, or the book for that matter. It is a good book. But he makes the point, or he makes the observation, that from an evolutionary biology standpoint, and that's the perspective that he's writing from, from that standpoint, it's really hard to explain how humans have come out on top. That because so many of the things that creatures need to survive and win, we don't have them. And then he says, save for one thing. And he would say it's not just our prefrontal cortex, it's not just our brain in general, it's neuroplasticity. And what he gets into in greater detail is that humans are uniquely born with a rather unformed brain, which makes them extraordinarily adaptable to any number of different environments. And in the span of a single lifetime, not to mention the span of just a couple generations, we can live in conditions, for better and for worse, quite unlike what maybe the generations before us did. But again, are you aware that you're becoming someone? Built into neuroplasticity, it would seem, is both a remarkably encouraging thing and a terrifying thing. That you're becoming something. And one way to read Matthew 23, and I think Steve did such a great job with the emotion of it, is to hear it as this Jesus who wants to threaten you and literally scare the hell out of you. The other is to see it as a Jesus who's doing observational truth. When I study the text, I'm just filtering for three things. What's a question I have? What's a promise that I'm reading? What's an observation that I could make? And one of the observations from Matthew 23, it would seem would be careful, because you're plastic. Which is to say, you can be molded and shaped in a bunch of different directions. Let's look again at verse 15. There's just a few places I want to zero in and ask some questions, and I think lead us in a place where we can reflect. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. I think it leads to this question, like, what if it's possible to become something other than who you set out to become? And again, when you read that, you're like, well, of course it is. But what if part of the reason Matthew's doing this is to remind us that actually is the case, that you can set off in one direction and end up somewhere else. It's the reminder, too, of, I once heard Erwin McManus make this point in a book, and it's kind of absurd, but I think it makes a point, and that is, like, to translate it to Helena, the little 5-year-old ponderosa tree growing on Mount Helena, it's under no threat of becoming a goat. But it's also under no threat of becoming a kind tree or an angry tree, like an evil tree or a wicked tree. But that's different for humans. We can't become a giraffe, but there's this kaleidoscope of potential things that we can become, despite intention, despite where we start from. Like, there's this potential for repentance, which is a gift, and there's this potential for going off the proverbial deep end or off the cliff. Or look at this one. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It's these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. Again, what if it's possible to build your identity around the wrong priorities? And even for those of us who identify with Jesus, notice he doesn't say the tithing of these minute kind of spices and things is in any way not valuable. He's just saying they've focused on the wrong thing. They've given priority to the wrong things. Or look at this next one. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you're like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they're full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. What if it's possible to look the part and not actually be the part? I mean, this is the terror of all things. We can go to that next slide, of all things intentionality and character and space, isn't it? That Jesus observes, and part of what N.T. Wright and other commentators that I trust, part of what they point out over and over and over again, especially around these strong critiques of the Pharisees and the scribes, is that it's almost impossible for us to be as shocked by these critiques as the original audience would have been. Because especially among northern Galilean Jews, like these were the examples. So emotionally what these people are experiencing when Jesus critiques them, they would say, is not altogether different when one of our evangelical leaders falls. There's this shock of like, wait a minute, you're telling me that these guys aren't who they say they are, which comes again with this warning. We can see that as an external, or we can see the potential for the internal. I want to use this example. There's this thing called the yamadori. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. It's, I'm assuming, a Japanese word, and a yamadori is, I'm about to get into nerdy bonsai technical language. Are you ready? Or if you're really pretentious in the bonsai world, it's bonsai. I still haven't figured out if I want to commit myself to that. But a yamadori it's the most classical form of a bonsai because it's collected from the wild. So many times what we see is nursery stock that's grown and trained from nursery stock. But in its original iteration, and many would say, and it's still its purest iteration, what a bonsai is it's something that's grown in the wild. It's gnarly, it's twisted, it's grown in these weird conditions, and it's collected. You don't shoot it with a gun, you collect it with a shovel, and then you bring it back, and then you train it. So this would be an example of something that this isn't quite what it looked like in the wild. This is where art and nature kind of meet. Well, a couple months ago, my oldest and I, we went out to Rimonai to some friends' land, and I wanted to try to collect yamadori, because I've been, and this is a horrible example, but it, I think, illustrates a point. It's an intimidating thing to do yamadori, and especially of this in Montana, because we have this thing called dormancy, and we don't have winters where it gets down to 20 degrees, we have winters where it gets down to 40 below, and so it's one thing for this thing to go dormant when it's in the ground, it's another thing to go dormant when it's in something even as shallow as this pot, not to mention a bonsai pot. So I've mostly avoided it, but recently I've been learning some stuff, and I've kind of wanted to mess with it. So we went out there, and really without the intention of finding the ideal one, because I fully intend to kill the first 50 that we collect. Not because I want to, but because I assume that'll happen. I've only since learned that Rocky Mountain juniper, which I'm pretty sure this is like the hardest thing to collect. But I just want to make this point. The extent to which this thing is currently alive is actually pretty unclear. I mean, we know this from our Christmas trees, right? We cut them down in early November or late November, and when the snow melts in March and they're still sitting next to our dumpster, they're still green in many cases. So part of the process, and it's this hilarious one, because I've got this in my yard, and if this ever becomes a bonsai, it's a decade from becoming so, but stage one is trying to reestablish the roots and see if it's even alive. But it raises this point, I think, that we can't actually visually take this in and accurately judge whether or not it's even alive. It could be dead already. You could support evidence that it is, you could support evidence that it isn't. And it seems like this is like one of the basic observations Jesus makes about the human religious experience. Be careful. Be careful about assuming something based upon the outside. This gets us burned, this creates cynicism, this creates all kinds of problems. But I think it can also lead to this question. Next slide. Are we to take a high view or a low view of the Pharisees? Now, it's my understanding that to take a low view of the Pharisees would mean to assume that they were more or less sociopaths who intended to become the corrupt kind of religious, cultural elites that they became. That is, 4- and 5-year-old children, they were so formed in their own family of origin, or they were so evil in their own intent, that they've become the very thing they set out to become. A high view of them, in my view, would be to assume the opposite, that they were kids in VBS. They were college kids in some kind of a campus ministry. They were adults that had an experience that really kind of pushed them towards God, and they really were intending to become men and women of integrity and purity of faith and winning in the right ways. And they didn't. Next slide. I would hate to trivialize the predatorial sexual abuse of Bill Cosby, but I think the lightning rod that he is can help make this point. How do we read Bill Cosby? And to be clear, I don't know. I don't have enough information to know accurately, but I think it can at least illustrate this. Is the narrative of Bill Cosby that he was some kind of sociopath who formed a life and a career for himself to live out the very kind of evil that in the end he did? Or do we read Bill Cosby as someone who was a young, talented person with a very plastic future out in front of him, who experienced success and wealth and privilege, and along the line became his own nemesis, became the antithesis of the very person he set out to be? Which, next slide, I think raises this question. Are the stories like Matthew 23, are they stories about them, or are they warnings to us? Are there something we're supposed to point a finger at, or do they provide a mirror that we're supposed to look into ourselves? And to the extent that we can agree that there's a potential in all of us for this, which doesn't in any way neglect the need for justice, but does potentially change the conversation internally for us, what are we to do? And here too, I want to suggest that built into Jesus' ethics and value is a potential solution. Listen to verse 26. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup so that the outside may become clean. Simplistic, of course, but it does make the point, and it reaffirms a point, reconnects with a point Jesus has made from the very beginning. In fact, if you follow Dallas Willard, which I do closely, then he would argue potentially the most important verse in the Gospel of Matthew is Matthew 5:20 at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, when Matthew says, or Jesus says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not worthy of heaven. Which, if we slow down, leads to this question of so what was the righteousness, what was the goodness of the scribes and Pharisees that God rejects? And Jesus then goes off into a sermon where what he rejects is behavior modification and the avoidance of heart transformation. And what he's suggesting is it's not a shame narrative. He's saying, align with me and we can deal with your heart. They say don't murder, and Jesus goes, it's really not about that. It's about anger and contempt and how do you navigate disappointment. They say don't sleep with the wrong person, and Jesus goes, that's really not the issue. The issue is human lust, the priority and the place and the human identity of sex. Whether or not you value people or see them all as a means to your physical ends. There's this conversation don't sign this vow and you can take this vow and sign this contract, and Jesus is like, it's not really about that. We got to deal with the human need to control God and those around us. To the extent that we take Jesus' promise seriously, it's nothing short of a promise that he can give us the right kind of heart, the inside, and the rest will take care of itself. So if we're to avoid becoming the person that he is saying that we avoid, it's first and foremost a call back to character. It's a reminder that we celebrate the external wins, and God does it differently. And then he says this, and I just, maybe it's because I bring a bias, I certainly do, but listen to verse 37. Jerusalem, and I love the emotion that Steve read this with, the city that kills the prophet and stones those who were sent to it. How often I have desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. I think we have to give credence to the historical context of what's going on here, because Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew in particular, has over and over and over warned the Jewish people that they're on this collision course with Rome where they're going to try to win might with might, and it's not going to work. And it didn't. Jesus, he could see the fall of Jerusalem coming. That much is clear from the Gospel of Matthew. But aside from that historical context, also notice just the raw emotion. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I desired to gather your children together. Just this week, Gay, who leads our nursery, who also has a small farm and chickens, was talking about eggs getting fertilized, and it was an educational experience. It was supposed to be funny. Who knew? But she also talked about, in the rare instance that she's had hens with chicks, the remarkable thing that it is, and I've never seen it. But she was describing how a hen just has to make the smallest of sounds, and it's this distinct sounds that tells the chicks, come gather underneath my wings. And there's another sound, she says, that tells the chicks it's time to eat. And she just described in very simple detail, I guess, simple language, that there's this, you could just tell the emotion from her of it's a pretty special thing to watch. Interesting, isn't it, that Jesus chooses that feminine metaphor to really, it seems, get after the emotional desires that he had. Which makes me think that to the extent that we're trying to avoid becoming the wrong kind of person, we got to be careful not to overcomplicate it. that this is the with words God. This is the God who says, come follow me, come be my disciples. He's the God who wants to be with all the way back in the garden. And that reminded me, I'm reading a book right now called Light from Light. It's a reflection on the Nicene Creed by a guy named Robert Barron. And there's this sentence in there, or a couple sentences that just has captivated my attention. Go to the next slide. He says, the rescue operation that the Lord inaugurates with Abram is primarily a matter of teaching people how to listen to him again. Now, just pause there, because if you're not familiar with the Abram narrative, I think it's important that we just kind of quickly bring ourselves up to speed. The narrative of the text is a God who creates people to be his image bearers, to be with them, that they would be co-creators on the planet, in the soil, in physical space. And we don't know the time span, they at some point decide that they're going to be their own discerners of good and evil rather than receive his ideas for that. And that leads to mayhem. They eventually become separated from God, kicked out of the garden. Murder and violence and all kinds of other things happen. And if you read the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it's really a story of like, how did they get so off course? And then Genesis 12 happens. And it starts with this guy named Abram, and God says, Abram, I want you to leave here and go there. And Abram, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to be a blessing to others. Through you, all nations will be blessed. It's what leads many Bible scholars to say your Bible really pivots the first 11 chapters and then Genesis 12 through the end of it. It's a God who's committed to rescuing his project. But notice it's predicated not upon a tablet of tenets and isms, not upon a complex creed or theology. Listen again to what he's saying. The rescue operation that the Lord inaugurates with Abram is primarily a matter of teaching people how to listen to him again. And I guess to the extent that there's any resonance to what I'm saying, I think another way of asking that introductory question is, have you still given priority to God's voice? Is the God who called you then still given space to talk now? Look how he continues. Abraham's faith is tantamount to his willingness to attend to a voice that transcends his own. There's a church in Melbourne, Australia, led by a guy named Mark Sayers. I think it's called Red Church. I learned recently that they have a saying. It's kind of built into their culture, and they call it winning the day. Win the day, they'll say to each other. And their definition of win the day is first thing in the morning, like coffee in hand, no TV yet, no external anything, and they literally talk about taking their phone and walking it to the furthest part of the house, and then going to the defined opposite furthest point from that, and winning the day by starting the day before God. And they allow that in some seasons and some days, you've got 20 seconds to maybe recite Psalm 23. And some days maybe you've got 20 minutes to read a chapter from the Gospel of Matthew. But their definition of win the day and winning every day is making this conscious choice to start every day with some kind of personal communion with God that creates space for the clarifications of God to direct life. Obviously, we've all got to pay our fee right now and make our own choices on how we're going to engage technology and phones and the pervasive nature of it all. But I know for me personally, what resonated about that is I'm just convinced that the solutions that we're searching for, they must start in some of the more pervasive things that everybody is making allowance for, like screens and media. Listen, Jesus, on some level, brings this warning. It's easy to get off track. It's even easier to arrive at the end of your life and only for the first time have it occur to you that you became the wrong kind of person. And it seems clear that his method of avoiding that is somehow finding ways to keep it simple and stay close. Is it limited to personal devotional time and prayer time and reading the Bible? Of course it's not. Does it start there? I think we have thousands of years of history that say, yeah, it really does. So what I'd like to do this morning is just give you some space. We recognize that life is busy, and so part of, we hope, what communion does is just creates space for you. And I think that historically, communion has this function of creating space for repentance and just allowing God to point stuff out. And so we're going to loop through and grab communion as we normally do. If you've not been with us before, you'll pick it up pretty quickly, I'm sure. But we just go through one row at a time. The band will lead us in a song, and then after the first song, Justin will get up here and we'll take it together. I'd like to pray before we do all that, and as the band comes up here. God, thanks. Thanks that your hopes for us, oftentimes they're bigger than the ones we have for ourselves, and at the same time, they're probably not as individualistic, that you call us to win together and in community. And God, we're trusting that in this little corner of time, in this little corner of the planet, that you're not just doing something in me or him or her, but in us. And as we think about winning the day, I pray that you kind of navigate all of that for us and what convictions we might leave with. We love you, God. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.